Sometimes the family that rejects you is preparing you for the family that will claim you. The wrought-iron gates of Bellwether House groaned open, like a mouth exhaling secrets as Elena Rossetti's rental car crunched down the oyster-shell driveway. Pregnant, broke, and carrying nothing but a leather satchel and her mother's final cruel words, she had come to this forgotten corner of the South Carolina Low Country to claim an inheritance from a great aunt she'd never met. The August heat pressed down through the canopy of ancient live oaks, and somewhere in the Spanish moss, she could swear she heard voices, women's voices, soft and welcoming. But Elena was an art conservator, trained to see beneath surface beauty to the hidden damage beneath, and as she stepped onto the wraparound porch of the antebellum mansion, she noticed something impossible. Fresh flowers in the window boxes, warm light glowing from within, and the faint scent of magnolia and lavender, as if someone had been expecting her arrival. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman who looked exactly like Elena, if Elena was 60 years older. "Welcome home, dear," the woman said, as naturally as if they'd spoken yesterday. "We've been waiting." Who were these women, and why did they all share Elena's face? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's hand froze halfway to the door knocker, her breath catching in the humid air. The woman standing before her had Elena's dark eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw, even the identical small scar above the left eyebrow. A childhood mishap Elena had always assumed made her unique. "I'm sorry. I think there's been a mistake." Elena's voice came out smaller than she intended, her Charleston accent softening despite years of trying to train it away. "I'm here about Constance Bellwether's estate. The lawyer said the house would be empty." The woman smiled, and even that expression was unsettlingly familiar, the way Elena's own mouth curved when she was keeping a secret. "Oh, honey, this house is never truly empty. I'm Magnolia Bellwether, though most folks called me Maggie before." She gestured vaguely at herself, as if her existence required no further explanation. "Constance was my great-niece, sweet child, though she never could master the art of proper preservation. Come in before the mosquitoes carry you off." Elena hesitated on the threshold, her conservator's eye automatically cataloguing details. The hardwood floors gleamed with recent polish, not the neglect she'd expected from a house whose owner had died 3 months ago. Portraits lined the walls, women in period dress spanning what looked like a century and a half, all bearing variations of Elena's features. The scent of magnolia wasn't just from outside. Someone had placed fresh blooms in a crystal vase on the entry table. "Who's been maintaining the house?" Elena asked, stepping inside despite every instinct screaming at her to run. She'd learned to trust those instincts during her 29 years, especially when it came to family. Blood relations had a particular talent for creating beautiful facades that crumbled when examined too closely. "Oh, we all pitch in," Maggie said, leading her deeper into the house. "The parlor's this way. I do hope you're not one of those modern girls who think sweet tea is too much sugar." Constance left very specific instructions about proper hospitality. The parlor was a museum piece, or should have been. The furniture was clearly antebellum, the kind Elena had spent her career studying and preserving. But instead of the careful roping and climate control such pieces required, they sat casually arranged as if in daily use. A half-finished embroidery project lay across the arm of a settee that belonged in the Smithsonian. "Now then," Maggie settled herself in a wingback chair that creaked familiarly under her weight. "Let's have a proper look at you. Yes, you've got the Bellwether bones, though I suspect you inherited the Rossetti stubbornness from your mother's side. How is Victoria these days?" Elena's hand instinctively moved to the slight curve of her belly beneath her cotton dress. 3 months had passed since her mother's public rejection, but the wounds were still raw. "We're not speaking." Maggie's expression softened with understanding. "The curse of independent women. We're only appreciated after we're gone." Your great-aunt Constance had the same trouble with family. They never could understand why she chose this place over their expectations. About Constance, Elena said, grateful for safer ground. I never knew she existed until the lawyer contacted me. My family never mentioned any bellwethers. Families have a way of forgetting the branches that don't grow the way they'd prefer. Maggie stood and moved to an ornate secretary desk, withdrawing a manila envelope. Constance left this for you specifically, said you'd need it when you were ready to understand. Elena accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. Her name was written across it in spidery handwriting, but underneath, in faded ink, she could make out other names: Isabella, Catherine, Margaret. Women's names stretching back generations. How many of us have there been? The question slipped out before Elena could stop it. Enough to know that running doesn't change anything, a new voice said from the doorway. Elena turned to see another woman, this one appearing to be in her 30s, wearing a dress that belonged to the 1920s. I'm Catherine. I tried to leave once, made it all the way to Atlanta before. She gestured to her own obvious pregnancy. Well, the house has a way of calling us home. Elena's pulse quickened. This was impossible. Whatever game these women were playing, whatever elaborate con they were running on grieving families, she wouldn't be their next victim. She'd learned in Charleston's art world that beautiful things often hid the ugliest deceptions. I think I should go, Elena said, clutching the envelope. I'll contact the lawyer about selling the property. Oh, sweetheart, Maggie said gently, you can't sell what was never truly yours to begin with. The house chooses its own. And besides, she nodded toward the window where Spanish moss swayed in the breezeless air, where exactly would you go? Back to Charleston, where your mother made her feelings clear? Or perhaps you'd prefer to face parenthood alone in some city where no one knows your name? The truth of it hit Elena like a physical blow. She had nowhere else to go. Elena's fingers tightened around the envelope as Maggie's words settled over her like the oppressive low-country heat. The truth was a bitter pill. She truly had nowhere else to go. Her Charleston apartment lease had expired 2 weeks ago, her few belongings crammed into the back of her aging Honda Civic. The art conservation job at the Gibbs Museum had ended with the summer exhibition, and despite her master's degree and 5 years of experience, no one seemed eager to hire a pregnant woman with a growing belly and no references from society families. I need some air, Elena said, pushing past Catherine toward the front door. The walls of the parlor suddenly felt too close, the portraits of familiar-faced women watching her with knowing eyes. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the canopy of live oaks, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the overgrown garden. Elena sank onto the front steps, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. At 4 months, the pregnancy was becoming harder to hide beneath loose dresses and flowing cardigans. Soon, there would be no concealing what her mother had called evidence of your moral failure. The envelope crinkled in her lap as she turned it over, studying the layers of names written in different hands, different eras of ink. How many women had sat on these same steps, pregnant and cast out, clutching letters that promised answers? The thought made her skin crawl with a mixture of fascination and dread. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, her former colleague at the museum. Coffee tomorrow? Heard about the inheritance. Lucky you. Elena almost laughed at the irony. Lucky if only Sarah knew she was sitting on the steps of a house inhabited by women who claimed to be dead, while her bank account dwindled toward zero and her stomach churned with morning sickness that lasted all day. She scrolled through her contacts, a pathetic list that had grown smaller since the cathedral incident. Most of Charleston's art world moved in the same circles as her mother's social set. Victoria Rossetti's public rejection had effectively blacklisted Elena from the community that had once embraced her expertise. The few friends who still spoke to her did so with the careful distance people maintained around scandal. Elena pulled up her mother's contact information, her thumb hovering over the call button. 3 months of silence stretched between them, filled with everything Elena couldn't bring herself to say. That she was scared, that she missed their Sunday brunches at the Charleston Place Hotel, that she sometimes caught herself reaching for her phone to share a funny story or ask about Dad's latest golf tournament before remembering that bridge had been burned to ash. But pride, that Rossetti's stubbornness Maggie had mentioned, kept her from making the call. Elena had learned early that love in the Rossetti household came with conditions, expectations that must be met and maintained. Her pregnancy, with its inconvenient questions about paternity and timing, had revealed the fragile foundation of her family's acceptance. A movement in her peripheral vision made her look up. Through the parlor window, she could see Maggie and Catherine in animated conversation, their mouths moving though no sound carried outside. They gestured toward Elena occasionally, and she felt the distinct impression of being discussed, evaluated, perhaps even pitied. The envelope grew heavier in her hands. Part of her, the conservator's trained mind, wanted to tear it open and examine its contents with scientific detachment. But another part, the part that had learned to be wary of family secrets, warned her that some knowledge couldn't be unknown once acquired. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The lawyer's name flashed on the screen. "Miss Rossetti, I trust you've arrived at Bellwether House safely." Elena glanced back at the front door, wondering how to explain what she'd found inside. "Yes, though there seems to be some confusion about the property's current occupants." A pause. "Occupants? The house has been empty since Miss Bellwether's passing. I have the keys right here in my office. I was planning to drive them out to you tomorrow." Elena's stomach lurched. "Then how did I get inside?" "I beg your pardon?" "There are women here. 2 of them. They knew I was coming." Even as she said it, Elena realized how insane it sounded. Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Rossetti, perhaps the stress of recent events. The house has been thoroughly inspected. Security checks have been regular. I assure you, no one has been living there." Elena ended the call with shaking hands, staring at the phone as if it might offer a rational explanation. The late afternoon heat pressed against her skin like a damp cloth, making it hard to breathe. Spanish moss stirred in the breezeless air, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the low call of a heron from the marshlands. Inside the house, a grandfather clock chimed the hour. 6 slow, resonant notes that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. Elena looked down at the envelope in her lap, at the names of women who had sat in this same spot, facing the same impossible choice between a past that had rejected them and a future that defied explanation. The baby fluttered inside her, the first time she'd felt movement, as if responding to the weight of the decision before them both. Elena's breath caught at the sensation, a butterfly whisper against her ribs that transformed everything. The baby was real in a way it had never been before, no longer just nausea and fatigue, but a presence, a person moving inside her, her free hand spread across her belly, waiting for another flutter, another sign of the life that had turned her world upside down. The envelope's paper was thick beneath her fingers, expensive stock that had aged to cream. She lifted the flap carefully, her conservator's training making her conscious of preserving whatever lay inside. The wax seal, a magnolia blossom pressed into burgundy, cracked with age as she broke it open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, spanning decades of technology from daguerreotypes to Polaroids. Elena's hands trembled as she spread them across her lap. Every image showed a pregnant woman standing before Bellwether House, and every woman could have been Elena's twin. The clothing changed. Bustle, skirts, drop-waist dresses, shoulder-padded suits, flowing hippie gowns, but the faces remained hauntingly consistent. Dark eyes, stubborn jawlines, that same small scar above the left eyebrow. Beneath the photographs lay a letter, the paper so old it felt like fabric against her fingertips. The handwriting was different from the envelope, older, more formal, written with a fountain pen in fading indigo ink. To the next daughter. If you are reading this, then the cycle continues. You have been cast out, carrying life within you, carrying secrets you cannot or will not share. You have come here because you have nowhere else to go, and the house has called you home. My name was Isabella Bellwether, though I was born Isabella Mercier in New Orleans, 1873. I was 17 when I arrived at this house, pregnant and disgraced, given sanctuary by my great-aunt who understood what it meant to be a woman with no choices. I thought I would stay only until the birth. That was 1891. I never left. Neither did my daughter, nor hers, nor any of the women whose faces you see in these photographs. The house holds us, protects us, but it also binds us. There is a price for sanctuary, child. There is always a price. Elena's vision blurred as she read, the afternoon sun making the words dance on the page. This had to be some elaborate hoax, some cruel game designed to prey on vulnerable women. But the photographs felt authentic under her trained touch, the aging patterns consistent with their apparent dates. The first time is always the hardest. Catherine's voice came from behind her. Elena turned to find the woman in the 1920s dress standing in the doorway, her own hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Reading Isabella's letter, I mean, I threw up right there in the garden when I realized what she was telling me. "This is impossible," Elena whispered, though even as she spoke, she remembered the lawyer's confusion about occupants, the perfectly maintained interior of a supposedly empty house, the way these women moved through the rooms as if they belonged to another time. "Is it?" Catherine moved to sit beside her on the steps, her dress arranging itself in perfect pleats despite the humid air. "More impossible than your mother turning her back on her only daughter. More impossible than finding yourself pregnant and alone at 29. More impossible than inheriting a house from a woman whose existence was erased from family memory." The baby moved again, stronger this time, and Elena gasped. Catherine smiled sadly. "They always know when we're making the choice, when we decide to stay or run." "I can't stay here." Elena gathered the photographs with shaking hands, trying to stuff them back into the envelope. "This is insane. You're all insane, and I'm sitting here listening to ghost stories like they're real." "Then leave," Catherine said simply. "Drive back to Charleston. Sleep in your car if you have to. Find some charity that takes in pregnant women with nowhere to go. Pretend you never saw this place, never felt the baby respond to it." Elena stood, clutching the envelope against her chest. She could feel her heart hammering, could taste copper fear on her tongue. But as she looked toward her Honda Civic, parked beneath the ancient oak trees, she realized Catherine was right. Where would she go? Her savings account had perhaps 2 months of expenses left. Her professional reputation was destroyed. Her family had made their position brutally clear. "What happened to them?" she asked quietly. "The women in the photographs?" "We lived," Catherine said. "We raised our daughters. We found peace in this place, even if we could never leave it." "And the baby's fathers?" Catherine's smile turned mysterious. "That, my dear, is the heart of the curse, and the key to breaking it if you're brave enough to try." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky had been clear moments before. Spanish moss began to sway more urgently in the suddenly restless air, and Elena felt the baby flutter again, a rhythm like Morse code, like a message she couldn't quite decode. The choice stretched before her like the long drive leading away from Bellwether House, return to a world that had rejected her, or step across the threshold into a mystery that defied everything she thought she knew about reality. Elena stood frozen between her car and the house, the envelope pressed against her chest like armor that might protect her from an impossible decision. The thunder grew closer, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, each one landing with the weight of inevitability. She could smell the approaching storm in the air, ozone and wet earth, and something else, something that reminded her of the cathedral courtyard 3 months ago, when her world had collapsed in front of Charleston's finest families. "I need to think," she said, though the words came out barely above a whisper. Catherine nodded and rose gracefully from the steps, her 1,920 seconds dress somehow remaining pristine despite the gathering moisture. Of course, the blue room at the top of the stairs has always been for first-night guests. Maggie's laid out towels and soap, the good lavender kind from that shop in Savannah. I didn't say I was staying the night, but even as Elena protested, rain began to fall in earnest, and her car suddenly seemed very far away. Her practical cotton dress would be soaked through in seconds, and the thought of driving through a low-country thunderstorm while her mind reeled with impossible revelations made her stomach clench. Of course not, Catherine agreed with a knowing smile. Just until the storm passes. Inside, Maggie was lighting oil lamps, despite the fact that Elena had noticed modern electrical outlets in the walls. The warm glow cast dancing shadows across the portraits of familiar-faced women, making them seem to move and breathe in the flickering light. Elena found herself studying each one as she followed Maggie up the sweeping staircase, noting the subtle variations in features across generations. A stronger nose here, softer eyes there, but always that same stubborn jawline, always the protective hand placed over a pregnant belly. "That's Catherine there," Maggie said, pausing before a formal portrait in oils. She was a Charleston girl too, though from the other side of the harbour. Her family owned textile mills, very proper, very concerned about reputation. She moved to the next portrait, and that's Josephine, who arrived in 1943. Her sweetheart had shipped out to Europe and never came back. She was a nurse, delivered 3 babies right here in the house before modern hospitals took over. Elena's throat tightened. What about their families? Didn't anyone come looking for them? "Oh, child." Maggie's voice carried decades of sadness. When a family disowns a daughter, they don't generally come searching afterward. That's rather the point of disowning, isn't it? To cut the cord so completely that it's as if she never existed at all. The blue room was lovely in a way that made Elena's chest ache. A 4-poster bed with hand-sewn quilts, a writing desk positioned by tall windows that looked out over the marshlands, fresh magnolia blossoms in a simple ceramic vase. Someone had laid out a white cotton nightgown and a silver brush set that looked like it belonged in a museum. The care evident in these small touches was more tenderness than Elena had experienced in months. She set the envelope on the writing desk and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Rain streaked down in rivulets that distorted the view, making the Spanish moss appear to writhe and dance. Lightning illuminated the marshlands in stark silver moments, revealing the wild beauty of a landscape that existed outside of civilization's careful boundaries. Her phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. Elena laughed bitterly at her own naivety. She was trapped here until morning at the very least, in a house that defied logical explanation, with women who claimed to be from different eras but spoke of pregnancy and abandonment as if these experiences transcended time itself. She sank into the chair at the writing desk, her fingers tracing the envelope's edges. The photographs inside felt like evidence of something impossible, but her trained eye couldn't find fault with their authenticity. She'd spent 5 years learning to spot forgeries, studying paper composition and ink chemistry, and the subtle signs of digital manipulation. These images bore all the hallmarks of their respective time periods, the chemical signatures of different photographic processes, the appropriate aging patterns, even the historically accurate clothing and poses. But accepting their authenticity meant accepting something far more disturbing than a simple con game. It meant acknowledging that the fluttering sensation in her belly had grown stronger since entering this house, as if the baby recognized something familiar in these walls. It meant considering that her mother's brutal rejection might have been part of a pattern stretching back generations, a cycle of women cast out and drawn to this place like iron filings to a magnet. Elena pulled Isabella's letter from the envelope and read it again, this time focusing on the careful formation of each letter, the formal language that belonged to another century. The paper felt genuine under her fingertips, the right weight, the appropriate brittleness for something over 100 years old. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity, and Elena realized that whether she believed in curses or not, she was committed to staying until dawn. The choice that had seemed so urgent an hour ago would have to wait until morning, when she could think clearly without rain drumming against the windows and lightning splitting the sky. But as she prepared for bed in the borrowed nightgown, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the storm hadn't been coincidence at all. Elena slipped the white cotton nightgown over her head, her fingers fumbling with the pearl buttons that seemed impossibly small. The fabric felt soft against her skin, worn smooth by decades of use, and she wondered how many women had worn it before her, how many had stood in this same room, pregnant and abandoned, trying to make sense of circumstances that defied rational explanation. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had grown more violent, as if the low country itself was determined to keep her here. Thunder crashed overhead with such force that the windows rattled, and Elena found herself counting the seconds between lightning and sound, a childhood habit that usually brought comfort. But here, in this room that felt suspended between past and present, even familiar rituals felt strange. She pulled back the hand-sewn quilt and slipped between sheets that smelled of lavender and something else. Something like time itself, musty and sweet and inexplicably comforting. The baby moved again, more insistently now, and Elena placed both hands over her belly, feeling the small life that had upended everything she thought she knew about her future. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered to the flutter beneath her palms. The movement seemed almost responsive, as if the baby understood something Elena couldn't yet grasp. A soft knock at the door made her sit up. "Come in," she called, expecting Maggie with additional towels, or perhaps Catherine with more impossible stories. But it was neither. A third woman entered, elderly, with silver hair braided down her back and wearing a dress that looked like it belonged to the 1940s. She carried a steaming cup that filled the room with the scent of chamomile and honey. "I'm Josephine," she said, settling into the chair by the window as if she had every right to be there. "Maggie mentioned you might have trouble sleeping your first night. The tea will help. It's safe for expectant mothers." Elena accepted the cup with trembling hands, the warmth seeping through the ceramic into her palms. "You're the nurse. From the portrait." "I was, yes. Still am, I suppose, though the nature of my practice has evolved over the years." Josephine's smile was kind but tired, as if she'd had this conversation many times before. "You're wondering if we're real, if any of this is real, among other things." Elena took a sip of the tea, tasting chamomile and something herbal she couldn't identify. Almost immediately she felt her shoulders relax, the knot of tension in her chest loosening. "The lawyer said the house was empty. My phone has no signal. Women who claim to be from different decades are treating me like I belong here." "And you're pregnant and alone, with nowhere else to go," Josephine added gently. "That's always been the way of it. The house calls to those who need sanctuary, and we provide what comfort we can. But why? What do you get out of this elaborate performance?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the window glass where rain continued to streak down. "When I arrived here in 1943, I was 22 years old and 6 months pregnant. My fiancé had been killed at Normandy, though I didn't know it yet. I was still writing letters to a dead man and waiting for replies that would never come. My family had already made their position clear. No ring, no respectability, no daughter." Elena felt her throat tighten with recognition. "I planned to stay just until the birth, maybe a few weeks after to recover. I had this idea that I could go to California, start fresh, pretend I was a war widow. But then Margaret was born, my daughter, and something changed. The house, it holds you, not against your will exactly, but it becomes home in a way that makes leaving unthinkable. What happened to Margaret? She grew up here, happy and loved by 3 generations of women who understood what it meant to be cast out by the world. When she came of age, she left. The curse doesn't hold the daughters, only the mothers. She became a doctor, married a good man, raised children of her own. But when her time came..." Josephine gestured toward the portraits lining the hallway. "When her family turned their backs on her, she knew where to find sanctuary." Elena set down her teacup, her hands shaking again. "This is insane. You're telling me that my great-aunt's house is some kind of supernatural halfway house for pregnant women with family issues?" "I'm telling you," Josephine said, rising from her chair with the careful grace of someone much older than she appeared. that every woman in this house has been exactly where you are right now. Scared, alone, carrying a life that no one else wanted to acknowledge. We've all faced the same choice you're facing, which is whether to keep running from something you'll never outrun, or to finally stop and discover what you're truly capable of when you're not trying to meet someone else's expectations. Josephine paused at the door, her hand on the antique brass knob. The storm will pass by morning. You can leave then if you choose. But Elena, you feel it, don't you? The way the baby responds to this place? That's not coincidence. Alone again, Elena pressed her hands to her belly and felt the answering movement inside her. Outside, thunder rumbled with less violence now, but the rain continued its steady drumming against the windows. She was committed now, whether she admitted it or not. Come morning, she would have to choose, return to a world that had rejected her or embrace a mystery that defied everything she thought she understood about reality. The baby fluttered once more, and Elena closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to acknowledge what she'd been avoiding since the moment she'd driven down that long, moss-shrouded driveway. She had already chosen. The moment she'd crossed the threshold of Bellwether House, she'd stepped into a story much larger than her own. There would be no going back to Charleston, no return to her old life of careful respectability and measured risks. Whatever lay ahead, curse or sanctuary or something in between, she would face it here, in this house that had called her home. Dawn came soft and grey, filtering through the Spanish moss like watercolor bleeding through wet paper. Elena woke to silence. No rain, no thunder, just the gentle sound of marsh birds calling to each other across the wetlands. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, her hands instinctively moving to her belly, where the baby rested quiet and calm. The storm had passed, just as Josephine promised. Elena could leave now, return to Charleston, figure out some practical solution to her circumstances, pretend the last 18 hours had been nothing more than an exhausted pregnant woman's stress-induced hallucination. But as she sat up and reached for her clothes from the day before, she found them gone. In their place, someone had left a simple cotton dress in deep blue, along with comfortable sandals, and a note written in elegant script. The washing machine is temperamental with modern fabrics. This should fit. M. Elena held up the dress, recognizing the style as something from the 1950s, but clearly well maintained. The fabric felt substantial under her fingers, and when she slipped it on, it fit perfectly, as if it had been tailored specifically for her pregnant figure. Downstairs, she found the 3 women gathered around a massive oak table laden with breakfast dishes that made her stomach growl with sudden, fierce hunger. Real butter gleamed on warm biscuits, and the scent of country ham and fresh eggs filled the air. After months of crackers and ginger tea, her body's response was almost violent in its eagerness. "Appetite coming back?" Catherine asked, pouring coffee from a silver service that belonged in a museum. "That's always a good sign. Your body's adjusting to the house." "My body's hungry because I've barely kept food down for 3 months," Elena said, but she accepted the plate Maggie handed her and began eating with more enthusiasm than she'd felt since learning about the pregnancy. The food was perfect, everything seasoned exactly right, the eggs cooked precisely as she liked them, though she'd never mentioned her preferences. "Try the preserves," Josephine suggested, sliding a crystal jar across the table. "Maggie made them from the fig trees out back. The recipe's been in the house for generations." Elena spread the preserves on a biscuit and took a bite, then stopped chewing. The flavor was complex, sweet and rich with an undertone of something indefinable that made her think of summer afternoons and safety and belonging. It was exactly the taste she'd been craving without knowing what she craved. "How did you know?" she asked slowly. The 3 women exchanged glances. "Know what?" Maggie asked innocently. "The dress fits perfectly. The food is exactly what I want. You're treating me like I've already decided to stay, but I haven't." "Haven't you?" Catherine interrupted gently. "Elena, your car won't start." Elena set down her biscuit. "What do you mean it won't start?" "The storm," Josephine said. "Sometimes it affects the electrical systems. Modern cars are so sensitive. Let me guess. There's no cell phone service to call for help, and the nearest town is miles away. Elena's voice carried an edge of panic she tried to suppress. Well, Maggie said thoughtfully, there is Ezra. He might be willing to take a look. Who's Ezra? Lives in the old groundskeeper's cottage, Catherine explained. He's been here, about as long as any of us. Keeps the property maintained, tends the gardens. Very handy with mechanical things. Elena stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. I want to see him, now. The three women didn't object, though she caught another of those meaningful glances between them. Maggie led her through the house and out a side door Elena hadn't noticed before, along a path that wound through ancient camellias and towering azaleas toward a smaller structure barely visible through the moss-draped trees. The cottage looked like something from a fairy tale, whitewashed stone with a thatched roof and flower boxes overflowing with herbs. Smoke curled from the chimney despite the morning warmth, and Elena could hear the sound of metal on metal, someone working in what must be a workshop behind the building. Ezra? Maggie called out. We have a guest who needs assistance. The hammering stopped, and a man emerged from the workshop, wiping his hands on a leather apron. Elena felt her breath catch. He was perhaps 35, tall and lean with dark hair and eyes the color of marsh water. His face was angular, intelligent, and when he looked at her, she felt a jolt of recognition that made no sense. Car trouble? He asked, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. It won't start, Elena managed. I need to get back to Charleston. Ezra studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the borrowed dress, her obvious pregnancy, the way she held herself like someone ready to run. Let me take a look, he said finally. Though I should warn you, sometimes what seems like car trouble is really something else entirely. Elena's hands clenched at her sides. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning, Ezra said, setting down his leather apron with deliberate care, that cars don't usually stop working just because of rain. Modern vehicles are designed to handle weather. His marsh water eyes held hers steadily, but they do tend to develop problems when their owners are running towards something they're not ready to face. That's ridiculous. It's a mechanical issue, not some mystical... Is it? He was already walking toward where she'd parked, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep up. Maggie had quietly disappeared back toward the house, leaving them alone on the moss-dappled path. Elena's car sat exactly where she'd left it, looking absurdly modern and out of place among the ancient live oaks. Ezra popped the hood and leaned over the engine, his movements confident and practiced. Elena found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the way his dark hair caught the filtered sunlight, and had to force herself to look away. Battery connections are fine, he murmured, checking various components with hands that moved like he'd been working on engines his entire life. Alternator's good. Starter's not the problem. He straightened and wiped his hands on a cloth from his pocket. Try starting her up. Elena slid behind the wheel, her heart hammering as she turned the key. The engine turned over immediately, purring to life as if nothing had ever been wrong. She sat frozen, staring at the dashboard where every light indicated perfect normal function. I don't understand. Last night it was completely dead. Last night you were panicked and exhausted. Ezra appeared at her driver's side window, leaning down so their faces were level. Fear has a way of making everything seem broken, even when it's not. So you're saying my emotional state somehow affected my car's electrical system? I'm saying, his voice dropped lower, more intimate, that this place has a way of keeping people here until they're ready to leave. Really ready, not just scared and running. Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The engine hummed beneath her, ready to carry her away from this impossible house and its impossible inhabitants. All she had to do was put it in reverse, back down that long driveway, return to Charleston and figure out how to rebuild her life from the wreckage her mother had left behind. But as she reached for the gear shift, the baby moved, a strong, definitive kick that made her gasp. The sensation was different from the fluttering she'd grown accustomed to. This felt like protest, like the child inside her was objecting to the very idea of leaving. Elena. Ezra's voice was gentle now, coaxing. What are you really afraid of? The question hit her like a physical blow. She stared through the windshield at the house, where three women who claimed to be from different decades waited with supernatural patience, and felt something inside her chest crack open. That this is real, she whispered. That everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, is wrong. That my baby is part of something I can't understand or control. Her voice broke. That I'm not strong enough to break whatever cycle brought me here. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the window frame. And what are you afraid will happen if you stay? That I'll never leave. That I'll become one of them, trapped in this beautiful prison, telling stories to the next pregnant woman who stumbles through the door. Elena laughed bitterly. Listen to me. I'm talking about magical curses like they're real things. Maybe they are. Maybe what you call a curse, other people call sanctuary. Ezra stepped back from the car. The engine's running fine. You can leave whenever you want. But Elena, he paused, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Some things are worth staying to fight for. Some mysteries are worth solving, even when the answers change everything you thought you knew. Elena sat in her running car, feeling the weight of choice pressing down on her like the humid, low-country air. Behind her, the house waited with its impossible inhabitants and their stories of women who'd faced the same crossroads. Ahead, the driveway stretched toward a world that had already rejected her and her unborn child. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Elena found herself thinking about the preserves that tasted like belonging, about Josephine's gentle hands and Maggie's knowing smiles, about Catherine's matter-of-fact acceptance of circumstances that defied logic. Slowly, she turned off the engine. "I'll stay," she said, the words feeling like a door closing behind her and another opening ahead. "But I want answers, real ones. About the house, about the curse, about why my family never spoke of Constance." She looked up at Ezra, whose expression had shifted into something that might have been relief. "And I want to know why you look at me like you've been waiting for me to arrive." Ezra's face went carefully blank, but not before Elena caught something that looked like panic flicker across his features. "That's a complicated question. I'm getting used to those." Elena stepped out of the car, slamming the door with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the moss-draped silence, and she felt the baby startle inside her at the sharp noise. Everyone here speaks in riddles and half-truths. The women in the house act like they're preparing me for something, but won't say what. You look at me like you recognize me, but we've never met. I'm tired of being treated like I'm the only one who doesn't know the rules to this game. "It's not a game," Ezra said quietly. "I wish it were." The baby kicked hard, and Elena pressed her hand to her side with a sharp intake of breath. The movement was strong enough that she could see it through the fabric of the borrowed dress, a clear outline of tiny limbs pushing against her belly. Ezra's gaze dropped to her hand, and his expression shifted into something Elena couldn't read. "When's your due date?" he asked. "January." "Why does that matter?" "January 21st. Elena's blood went cold. "How could you possibly know that?" Instead of answering, Ezra turned and started walking back toward the cottage. "There's something you need to see. Something the women in the house probably haven't shown you yet." Every instinct Elena had developed over 29 years of careful living screamed at her not to follow. But the baby had gone still inside her, unnaturally quiet, as if it too were waiting for whatever revelation lay ahead. She found herself walking after him, her borrowed sandals silent on the moss-covered path. The cottage's interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with exposed beams and stone walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. But it was the far wall that made Elena stop breathing. It was covered with photographs, dozens of them, spanning what looked like decades. All showed the same scene. Women in wedding dresses standing in what Elena now recognized as Bellwether House's garden. All of them looked exactly like her. "This is impossible," Elena whispered, stepping closer. The photographs were clearly from different time periods. She could see the evolution of dress styles, the aging of the camera quality. But every bride had her dark hair, her angular features, her height. They could have been sisters. They could have been the same woman photographed across a century. "Constance," Ezra said, pointing to a sepia-toned image from what must have been the 1870s. "Margaret, 1901. Victoria, 1923. Catherine, 1945. Josephine, 1962. Maggie, 1987. His finger traced along the wall. "And here." The most recent photograph showed a woman in a simple white dress, her hair crowned with camellias from the garden. The image was digital, clearly modern, and the bride's face was Elena's face. Exactly Elena's face, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. "That's not me," Elena said, but her voice cracked on the words. "I've never worn a wedding dress. I've never been married." "No," Ezra agreed. "You haven't." Elena spun to face him, and the sudden movement made the room tilt around her. He caught her arm, steadying her, and his touch sent a jolt through her that was both foreign and achingly familiar. "Ezra, what is this place? What's happening to me?" "The house calls to its daughters when they're pregnant and alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't call to just anyone. Every woman who's ever found sanctuary here has been a descendant of the original owner, Constance Bellwether. They all carry the same bloodline, the same face, the same gift." "Gift?" Elena pulled away from his touch, needing the distance to think clearly. "Being abandoned by your family while pregnant is a gift? Being able to break the cycle is." Ezra's marshwater eyes held hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Elena, every woman on that wall faced the same choice you're facing now. Stay and accept what the house offers, or leave and watch the pattern repeat in the next generation. None of them was strong enough to break it." "And you think I am?" "I think," he said, stepping closer, "that you're the first to arrive who wasn't running to the house. You were running away from it. That changes everything." The baby moved again, a rolling sensation that made Elena gasp and press both hands to her belly. This time, Ezra reached out without hesitation, his palm covering hers. The moment his skin touched hers, Elena felt it, a connection that ran deeper than physical contact, older than memory. "Oh God," she breathed. "You're the father." Ezra's face went pale, but he didn't deny it. "Not the way you think. Then how?" His hand tightened over hers, and Elena felt the baby respond to his touch like it recognized him. "That," he said, "is what we're going to find out." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Elena stared at Ezra's hand covering hers, at the way her baby moved beneath his palm as if reaching toward him, and felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crumble. "What do you mean, not the way I think?" Her voice came out sharp, desperate. "Either you're the father or you're not. There's no mystical interpretation of biology." Ezra's marsh-water eyes darkened. "Isn't there? In a house where women from different decades exist in the same space, where your car breaks down exactly when you need to stay, where you arrive pregnant with a child you don't remember conceiving?" The words hit Elena like ice water. "I remember," but even as she started to protest, the memories felt slippery, fragmented. She remembered the gallery opening in Charleston 6 months ago, remembered the wine, the celebration of her successful authentication of a colonial-era portrait, remembered going home alone to her apartment. She remembered waking up 2 months later with morning sickness that wouldn't quit, and a positive pregnancy test that made no sense. "No," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "No, I would remember. I would know if someone—" "Would you?" Ezra's voice was gentle, but his words were relentless. "Can you tell me his name? Can you describe his face? Do you remember choosing to be intimate with someone?" Elena's legs gave out, and she sank onto a worn leather chair that smelled of age and secrets. The room spun around her as she tried to grasp at memories that scattered like smoke the moment she reached for them. She remembered the gallery. She remembered the wine. She remembered nothing. A blank space where something crucial should have been. "This is insane," she breathed. "People don't just forget." but the words died in her throat because she was sitting in a house with women who claimed to be from different decades, discussing her pregnancy with a man who somehow knew her due date, whose touch made her unborn child respond like it was coming home. Elena. Ezra knelt beside her chair, his face level with hers. I need you to think carefully. That night in Charleston, what was the last thing you remember clearly? She closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that evening. The gallery had been crowded, filled with Charleston's art community celebrating her latest authentication. The portrait had been extraordinary, a woman in colonial dress whose face looked disturbingly familiar. Elena had stared at it for hours during her research, feeling a connection she couldn't explain. The painting, she whispered. I stayed late to look at the painting one more time. I felt drawn to it, like I knew her. Her eyes snapped open. She looked like me, exactly like me. Ezra's face had gone pale. What was her name? The woman in the portrait? Constance. The name fell from Elena's lips like a stone into still water. Constance Bellwether. The cottage went so quiet Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Through the window, storm clouds were gathering again, though the morning had been clear. The baby inside her had gone completely still. Elena, Ezra said slowly, that portrait disappeared from the gallery that night. Along with you. What do you mean it disappeared? I went home. I remember going home. Do you? His hand touched her face, and Elena felt the world tilt on its axis. Or, do you remember waking up in your apartment the next morning with no memory of how you got there? The truth hit her like a physical blow. She did remember waking up confused, her clothes different from what she'd worn to the gallery, a key in the door, though she always kept it in her purse. She'd attributed it to too much wine, too much excitement. She'd never questioned the blank hours between leaving the gallery and waking in her bed. You're saying I never went home that night, she said numbly. You're saying I came here. I'm saying the house has been calling to you your entire life. That portrait wasn't a coincidence. It was bait. The one time your bloodline has ever tried to bring a daughter home before she was pregnant and desperate. Elena stood abruptly, backing away from him. This is impossible. You're talking about magic, about curses, about things that don't exist in the real world. And yet here you are, Ezra said quietly, carrying a child you don't remember conceiving, in a house that shouldn't exist, surrounded by women who should be dead. The baby kicked suddenly, violently, and Elena doubled over with a cry of pain. This wasn't the gentle movement she'd grown accustomed to. This felt like panic, like her child was trying to escape something terrible. Blood began to seep through the borrowed dress. Something's wrong, she gasped, her vision blurring. The baby, something's wrong with the baby. Ezra caught her as she fell, his face stricken with an anguish that looked like grief. It's happening too fast, he whispered. You weren't supposed to remember. Not yet. Not like this. As darkness closed over Elena's vision, she heard him calling out toward the house, his voice breaking with desperation. The last thing she saw was his face above hers, and in his marsh-water eyes she finally saw the truth she'd been too afraid to recognize. He wasn't just the father of her child. He was terrified of what that meant. Elena drifted back to consciousness in waves, each one bringing fresh layers of impossible truth. She was lying in her bed at Bellwether House, but the quality of light filtering through the windows had changed, deeper, more golden, as if hours had passed. The bleeding had stopped, but the baby remained eerily still inside her. Catherine sat in a chair beside the bed, her 1940s dress immaculate as always, her hands folded with the patience of someone who had waited through decades. You're awake. How long? Elena's voice came out as a croak. Long enough for the immediate danger to pass. Your child is safe, but the awakening process is difficult. The house doesn't like its secrets exposed so quickly. Elena struggled to sit up, her head swimming. Through the window she could see Ezra pacing the garden with the restless energy of a caged animal. He's the father, not just of my baby, of all your babies. Catherine's composure never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. You're beginning to understand. No, I'm not understanding anything. Elena's voice cracked with desperation. I'm remembering fragments that don't make sense. I see flashes of that night, the gallery, the portrait, and then nothing. But sometimes, in dreams, I remember coming here. I remember him. Her hand moved protectively to her belly. How is that possible? How can he be the father of children born across a century? Because Ezra isn't bound by time the way we are. Catherine rose and moved to the window, her gaze settling on the man in the garden. He's the guardian of this place, the keeper of the bloodline. When the house calls to one of our daughters, he answers that call. Elena felt the world shift again, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. You're saying he's, what? Immortal? Some kind of supernatural entity who impregnates bellwether women? I'm saying he's cursed just as we are, trapped in a cycle he never chose. Catherine's reflection in the glass looked haunted. He remembers every woman, every child, every generation. He carries the weight of all our stories. The implications crashed over Elena like a cold wave. Then my baby isn't really his. It's something else, something the house created. Your baby is his child in every way that matters, Catherine said firmly. The love is real. The connection is real. But the circumstances... She turned back to Elena, and for the first time her perfect composure cracked. The circumstances are what we're all trying to escape. Elena forced herself out of bed, her legs unsteady but holding. What happens to the children? Where are all the babies you gave birth to? The silence that followed was deafening. Through it, Elena heard the truth her heart had been whispering since she'd arrived. They don't survive, do they? The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if speaking the horror simply would rob it of its power to destroy her. That's the real curse. We come here, we fall in love with him, we carry his children, and then we lose them. Not lose them, Catherine whispered. Give them up. The house demands a choice. Stay forever and watch your child fade away, or leave and break the connection that sustains them. Elena's knees nearly buckled. You're telling me that my baby will die unless I stay here? That I'll be trapped like you are? We're telling you that every woman before you has faced that choice, and every one has chosen to stay, to watch their children become part of the house's power, their life force feeding the curse that binds us all here. That's not a choice. Elena's voice rose to near hysteria. That's extortion. That's... The baby moved suddenly, strongly, and with its movement came a rush of images that weren't Elena's memories. She saw Ezra as he truly was, ageless, bound to the house by chains forged from love and loss. She felt his anguish across decades of watching women he'd grown to care for face an impossible decision. She experienced his terror that Elena, like all the others, would choose imprisonment over freedom. But beneath it all, she felt something else, something the other women hadn't possessed. Rage. Pure, incandescent fury at the system that had trapped them all, at the house that fed on their desperation, at the curse that turned love into a weapon against them. No, Elena said, her voice steady now, certain. This ends with me. Catherine's eyes widened. Elena, you don't understand the forces at work here. The house has power beyond anything you can imagine. It's survived for over a century because no one has been strong enough to truly challenge it. Then it's never met someone with nothing left to lose. Elena moved to the window, watching Ezra's pacing below. He looked up as if he felt her gaze, and the pain in his expression nearly broke her heart. I already lost my family, my career, my entire life was destroyed before I came here. The house thinks that makes me vulnerable, but it's wrong. She pressed her palm against the glass, and the baby stirred as if responding to her resolve. It makes me dangerous. The declaration hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before an ancient enemy. Catherine stared at Elena with something between admiration and terror, while through the window Ezra had stopped his restless pacing and stood perfectly still, his face tilted up toward them as if he could hear every word through the glass. Dangerous, Catherine repeated softly. Yes, perhaps you are. But Elena, you must understand, others have tried to fight before. Josephine in 1962 nearly brought the house down around our ears. The backlash killed her within hours of her attempt. Elena turned from the window, and Catherine was startled by the transformation in her face. Gone was the frightened, confused woman who had arrived seeking sanctuary. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, someone who had stared into an abyss and chosen to stare back. Josephine fought alone, Elena said. She didn't have what I have. And what's that? All of you. Elena's hand moved to her belly, where the baby had begun to move again, not with panic this time, but with what felt like anticipation. Every woman who came before me, every story, every attempt to break free. You're all still here, which means you're all still fighting. The house may have trapped you, but it hasn't defeated you. Catherine's breath caught. You want us to fight with you. I want us to finish what we started. Elena began to pace, her mind working with the focused intensity that had made her one of Charleston's most sought-after art conservators. Think about it. Why does the house need us to choose? Why the elaborate seduction, the false romance, the emotional manipulation? If it was truly all-powerful, it would simply take what it wanted. Because the magic requires consent, Catherine whispered, her eyes widening with understanding. Free will given freely. It can manipulate circumstances, create situations, but it cannot force the final surrender. Exactly. And that means the curse has a weakness. Elena stopped pacing and fixed Catherine with an intense stare. What was the original curse? Not the effects, not the pattern it created. What were the actual words spoken? Catherine's face went pale. We don't speak of that. The first constance, she forbade it. Said giving voice to the curse would only strengthen it. Or maybe she was afraid that understanding it completely would show us how to break it. Elena's voice grew stronger, more certain with each word. I'm an art conservator, Catherine. My job is to look at something beautiful that's been damaged and find a way to restore it to what it was meant to be. This house, this family, all of you, you're a masterpiece that's been corrupted. But corruption can be reversed if you understand its source. A knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret's voice called through the wood. Elena? Ezra is asking to see you. He says it's time you knew everything. Elena and Catherine exchanged glances. Everything? Elena called back. The beginning, Margaret replied. The real beginning. Elena straightened her shoulders and smoothed down the borrowed dress. When she looked at Catherine again, her expression was resolute. Then it's time I stopped running from the truth and started using it as a weapon. Catherine stood as well, and for the first time since Elena had met her, the ghost of a smile played at her lips. You truly are one of us, aren't you? Stubborn to the bone. I prefer determined. Elena moved toward the door, then paused. Catherine, when this is over, when I break this curse, what happens to all of you? I don't know, Catherine admitted. We might finally be able to rest, or we might simply cease. After so long trapped here, I'm not certain there's enough of us left to exist anywhere else. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Then we'll make sure you have somewhere better to go. She opened the door to find not just Margaret waiting, but Victoria and Josephine as well. Their faces held an expression Elena had never seen before. Hope. Fragile, terrified hope, but hope nonetheless. He's waiting in the garden, Victoria said, by the camellia tree where the first Constance is buried. Elena nodded and started down the hallway, but Josephine caught her arm. Elena, whatever he tells you, whatever you see, remember that the man you've come to care for is real. The house may have orchestrated your meeting, but what grew between you, that's yours. Don't let the truth poison what's genuine. I won't, Elena promised. Then, with 4 generations of bellwether women watching, she walked down the stairs and out into the garden where the father of her child waited to tell her how their story truly began. The baby moved within her as she approached Ezra, and Elena could swear she felt not just 1 heartbeat, but 5. Her own, her child's, and the echo of every woman who had walked this path before her, all of them beating in rhythm, all of them ready to fight. The camellia tree stood ancient and gnarled in the center of the garden, its dark green leaves rustling despite the absence of wind. Elena could feel the weight of the house pressing against her back as she approached, but she didn't turn around. Behind her lay generations of surrender. Ahead waited the truth that would either damn her or set them all free. Ezra stood with his back to her, one hand pressed against the weathered bark of the tree. When he heard her footsteps, his shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. "Her name was Constance Bellwether," he said, his voice carrying across the humid air. "The first one. I met her in 1847, when I was still human." Elena stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the tremor in his hands, far enough to run if the truth proved unbearable. "What were you then?" "A groundskeeper. Nothing more than a poor Irish immigrant trying to make an honest living." He finally turned, and Elena saw centuries of grief etched in the lines around his eyes. She was supposed to marry a plantation owner's son, arranged marriage, all very proper. But she was, he smiled sadly, she was like you, fierce, independent. She refused to be traded like livestock. The baby stirred restlessly as Elena stepped closer. "So she ran away." "She ran to me." His voice broke slightly. "God help us both, she ran to me, and I was fool enough to think love could conquer anything. We met in secret for months. I knew it was madness, knew her family would never accept a man like me, but when she told me she was carrying my child, you helped her escape." "I tried to." Ezra's laugh was bitter, hollow. "We planned to leave together, head north where her name wouldn't follow us. But her mother discovered our plan. Mrs. Evangeline Bellwether was not a woman to cross." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gathering storm clouds. What did she do? "She came here to this garden, to this very spot where we'd planned to meet one last time." Ezra knelt and placed his palm against a weathered stone marker Elena hadn't noticed before. "She brought her conjure woman, a slave who practiced the old magic, and she cursed us both." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Elena could feel them pressing against her skin, seeping into her bones. Around them, the garden had gone preternaturally still, as if even the insects feared to interrupt this confession. "What were the words?" Elena whispered. Ezra closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice changed, taking on a cadence that spoke of ritual and power. "Let no daughter of my blood know peace in love. Let them wander lost until they come to ground that remembers her shame. And you who stole my child's future, you will father daughters for every generation, watch them suffer as mine has suffered, and never know rest until the bloodline ends." The baby kicked violently, and Elena staggered, her hand flying to her belly. Around them, the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down with the weight of century-old rage and grief. "She didn't just curse us," Elena gasped, understanding flooding through her. "She cursed the land itself. That's why the house has power here. It's built on cursed ground. And I've been bound to it ever since." Ezra stood slowly, his face haggard, watching every woman I've come to care for face the same impossible choice. Stay and watch your child become part of the house's hunger, or leave and condemn them to fade away entirely. Elena stared at him, pieces of the puzzle clicking together with terrible clarity. "But there's something you're not telling me. Something about why it's different this time." He met her eyes, and she saw fear there, not for himself, but for her. Evangeline's curse had a condition, a way out, but no one has ever been strong enough to... "Tell me. If a daughter of the bloodline could face the truth of the original sin and choose to forgive rather than perpetuate the cycle of vengeance, if she could break the chain of abandonment and choose love over fear," he took a shuddering breath, "the curse would transfer to her, but only for as long as she chose to bear it." Elena felt the words hit her like a physical blow. "You're saying I could break the curse by taking it on myself, by choosing to stay here forever so everyone else could go free?" "Elena, no. That's not what I want for you. For us." But Elena was already shaking her head, her hand pressed protectively over her child. "It's not about what you want anymore. It's about what's right. She looked back toward the house, where she could see 4 figures watching from the windows. They've suffered long enough. The storm clouds overhead began to swirl faster, and Elena felt the house's attention focus on her like a predator sensing weakness. But she wasn't weak anymore. She was decided. "Show me where it began," she said firmly. "Show me exactly where she spoke those words. It's time to answer them." Ezra's face went ashen at her words, but he nodded slowly, as if he'd been dreading this moment for over a century. "The exact spot is beneath us," he said, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "Evangeline had them bury Constance here, unmarked, when she died in childbirth." Then she spoke the curse over her daughter's grave. Elena knelt beside the weathered stone marker, her palm joining his on the cold surface. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind with brutal clarity, a young woman's terrified screams echoing through the night, an older woman's voice rising in ritualistic fury, and beneath it all, the deep, hungry pulse of magic being born from anguish. "I can feel her," Elena gasped, her free hand clutching at the earth. "Constance. She's still here, still suffering. The curse didn't just bind you to this place, it trapped her soul as the foundation for everything that followed." The house behind them began to creak and groan, its windows flickering with unnatural light. The 4 women Elena could see watching from above pressed closer to the glass, their faces tight with anticipation and terror. "Elena, you don't understand what you're proposing to do," Ezra said urgently, his hand covering hers on the stone. "Taking on the curse means becoming its anchor point. You wouldn't just be trapped here, you'd become the source of its power. Every future daughter who might be born, every woman who might suffer, it would all flow through you. But it would also mean I could choose to end it." Elena's voice grew stronger as understanding crystallized. "If I'm the source, I'm also the key. Evangeline's curse was born from a mother's rage at losing her daughter's future. If another mother chooses to sacrifice her own future to restore what was stolen..." The baby moved violently within her, and this time Elena felt something she hadn't before: communication, not words, but pure emotion and intent. Her unborn child was trying to tell her something, fighting to break through the supernatural barriers that surrounded them. "She knows," Elena breathed, wonder and terror warring in her voice. "The baby, she knows what I'm thinking, and she's trying to warn me about something." Thunder cracked overhead, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. But these weren't ordinary raindrops. They struck the cursed ground and hissed like acid, steam rising where they touched the earth around Constance's grave. "The house is fighting us," Ezra said, pulling Elena to her feet as the rain intensified. "It knows what you're planning, and it won't let you break free easily." Elena stood her ground despite the stinging rain, her eyes fixed on the spot where everything had begun. Through the growing storm she could see a shimmer in the air above the grave, a figure taking shape, translucent and wavering but unmistakably there. Constance Bellwether, the first victim, was materializing. The ghostly figure was young, perhaps 20, with Elena's dark hair and stubborn chin. But where Elena carried herself with hard-won strength, Constance radiated nothing but pain. Her dress was stained with blood, her face frozen in an expression of betrayal and loss that had persevered across 150 years. "She's beautiful," Elena whispered, tears mixing with the acid rain on her cheeks. "She looks so much like..." "Like you," Ezra finished. "The bloodline runs true. Every generation produces a daughter who could be Constance's twin." The ghostly figure of Constance turned toward them, and when her eyes met Elena's, the world shifted. Suddenly Elena could hear the whispered conversations between walls, feel the desperate longing of every woman who had lived and died in this place, understand the deep well of power that had been feeding on their collective anguish for over a century. But she could also sense something else, a crack in the foundation, a weakness in the curse that no one had noticed before. Evangeline's magic had been powered by maternal love, corrupted into vengeance, but it had one fatal flaw: it had never accounted for a mother willing to love beyond her own bloodline. The curse can only be broken by someone who chooses to save strangers' children instead of just her own, Elena said aloud, the revelation hitting her like lightning. Evangeline could never imagine a mother sacrificing herself for daughters not yet born, for women she'd never meet. Constance's ghost nodded once, a movement so slight it might have been imagination, but Elena felt the confirmation in her bones. Around them, the storm reached fever pitch, and she could hear the house behind them groaning as if in physical pain. "That's why it has to be me," Elena continued, her voice rising above the wind. "Not just because I'm the latest in the bloodline, but because I'm the first one angry enough to fight for all of them instead of just myself." She looked at Ezra, seeing her own determination reflected in his ancient eyes. "Show me how to call her. Show me how to face Evangeline's ghost and answer her curse with something stronger." The final test was beginning, and Elena was ready. Ezra's hands shook as he reached into his coat and withdrew an object that made Elena's breath catch, a tarnished silver locket, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the stormlight. "This was Evangeline's," he said, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "She dropped it here when she spoke the curse. It's been the anchor point for her spirit ever since." He pressed it into Elena's palm, and the metal burned like ice against her skin. "Speak her name 3 times while holding this, and she'll have no choice but to answer." Elena felt the locket's weight like a stone in her chest. Around them, the storm had grown supernatural in its fury. Trees bending at impossible angles, rain falling upward in spirals, and the very air crackling with malevolent energy. Behind her, she could hear the house screaming, its windows exploding outward as the supernatural pressure became too much to contain. "Elena." Margaret's voice carried from somewhere in the chaos. "The others, they're starting to fade. Whatever you're going to do, it has to be now." Elena turned to see the 4 women stumbling from the house, their forms flickering like candle flames in a hurricane. Victoria's edges were already becoming translucent, and Catherine was losing cohesion entirely. The curse was feeding on the confrontation, drawing power from their collective presence to fuel whatever came next. "They're dying," Elena gasped. "Actually dying this time." "Because the curse knows its time is ending," Ezra said grimly. "Evangeline would rather destroy everything than lose control. You have to choose now. Call her forth and risk everything, or let them fade and save yourself." Elena looked at the locket, then at the women who had become her family, then at Constance's ghost, still hovering over her own grave. The baby kicked frantically inside her, and suddenly Elena understood what her child had been trying to communicate. Not fear, but readiness. Her daughter was preparing to fight alongside her. "I choose them," Elena said, her voice cutting through the storm with supernatural clarity. "I choose all of them. Every woman who came before, every daughter yet to be born. I choose love over fear." She raised the locket above her head and spoke the words that would change everything. "Evangeline Bellwether, Evangeline Bellwether, Evangeline Bellwether, I summon you to face your judgment." The world exploded. Light erupted from the locket. Not the warm glow of redemption, but the harsh, cold illumination of a lightning strike frozen in time. The ground beneath Elena's feet cracked and split, revealing glimpses of something vast and hungry writhing beneath the earth. And rising from the fissures came a presence so malevolent that Elena's knees buckled under its weight. Evangeline Bellwether materialized in all her terrible glory, not the elderly woman she'd been at death, but something far worse. The curse had transformed her into a creature of pure maternal rage, her form shifting between the grieving mother she'd once been and the monster she'd become. Her eyes burned with the accumulated anguish of 5 generations, and when she spoke, her voice was the sound of every lullaby turned to lamentation. "How dare you?" she hissed, her form towering over Elena despite the human shape she wore. "How dare you stand where my daughter died and speak to me of choice, you who carry the seed of the man who destroyed my bloodline?" Elena forced herself to stand, the locket still clutched in her fist. Around them, reality warped and twisted as the curse's full power manifested. She could see other versions of this moment. Every previous generation's failed attempt to break free, every woman who had stood in this spot and surrendered to despair. But she could also see what they had missed. "Your daughter chose love," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Constance chose Ezra, chose hope, chose to believe in a future beyond the one you planned for her, and you punished her for it. You punished every daughter since for the crime of wanting to be free." Evangeline's form flickered with rage. "She chose a man who was beneath her. She threw away everything I built for her. She chose happiness." Elena stepped forward, and where her feet touched the cursed ground, flowers began to bloom, not the twisted, hungry vines that had strangled the garden for decades, but simple white camellias, pure and clean. "And you were so afraid of losing control that you condemned her to an eternity of suffering rather than let her go." The ghost of Constance moved closer, her translucent hand reaching toward Elena. When their fingers touched, Elena felt a surge of understanding that knocked the breath from her lungs. She saw the truth that had been hidden for 150 years. Evangeline's curse hadn't just been about vengeance, it had been about keeping her daughter close, trapped forever in the place where they'd shared their last conversation. "You didn't curse us out of hatred," Elena realized, tears streaming down her face. "You cursed us out of love, twisted, possessive love, but love nonetheless. You couldn't bear to let Constance go, so you made sure no daughter would ever leave again." Evangeline's terrible form wavered, and for a moment Elena glimpsed the broken mother beneath the monster, a woman who had lost everything and chosen to drag the world down with her rather than face that loss alone. The confrontation had reached its crucial moment, and Elena knew that her next words would determine the fate of everyone she'd come to love. "I understand you," Elena said, her voice steady despite the supernatural maelstrom swirling around them. "I understand what it means to love someone so desperately that you'd rather destroy them than lose them. But understanding doesn't make it right." She raised her hand, and the locket's chain caught the otherworldly light. "I know what has to be done. I know the price of breaking this curse, and I'm willing to pay it. But not the way you think." Evangeline's monstrous form recoiled. "You cannot break what was forged in blood and buried in bone. The curse is eternal." "No," Elena said, stepping closer to Constance's grave. "The curse is a choice, your choice, and choices can be unmade." She looked directly at the ghostly figure of Constance, then at the fading forms of Margaret, Victoria, Catherine, and Beatrice. "But breaking it means I have to give up the one thing I want most in this world." Ezra's face went white with understanding. "Elena, no. There has to be another way." But Elena was already kneeling beside Constance's grave, pressing both hands to the earth where the first victim lay buried. "There isn't another way. Don't you see? The curse feeds on the connection between mothers and daughters, on that unbreakable bond of blood and love. To break it, I have to sever that connection willingly." The baby kicked frantically within her, and Elena felt her daughter's consciousness brush against hers, not with fear, but with understanding. Even unborn, this child possessed an ancient wisdom that transcended the supernatural barriers surrounding them. "She knows," Elena whispered, wonder and agony warring in her voice. "She understands what I'm about to do." Elena pressed the locket against her belly, feeling its cold metal burn through fabric to touch her skin. "I have to give her up, not to death, to freedom. I have to choose to let my daughter be born somewhere else, to someone else free of this bloodline and everything that comes with it." The very air around them seemed to shatter at her words. Evangeline's form convulsed, her rage transforming into something far more dangerous: confusion. "That's impossible. A mother cannot simply abandon her blood." "Abandon," Elena said, rising to her feet with tears streaming down her face. "Release. There's a difference." She turned to Ezra, memorizing his face even as her heart broke. "You have to take her away from here the moment she's born. Far away, to people who will love her but never know her heritage. She has to grow up completely free of this place and its power." "Elena, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Elena's voice cracked, but her resolve remained unshakable. I'm choosing to break the cycle not by taking on the curse, but by refusing to pass it forward, by loving my daughter enough to let strangers raise her." The ground beneath their feet began to glow with white light, not the harsh, cold illumination of the curse, but something warm and clean. Constance's ghost grew more solid, more present, as if Elena's sacrifice was feeding her spirit with the very thing it had been denied for 150 years, a mother's selfless love. Evangeline's monstrous form was dissolving, her rage unable to sustain itself in the face of something she had never anticipated, a mother choosing her child's freedom over her own happiness. "This is not how it ends," she shrieked, but her voice was already fading. "The bloodline is everything, the family is everything." "No," Elena said gently, pressing her hand to where Constance lay buried. "Love is everything. And sometimes love means letting go." The locket in her other hand crumbled to dust, its power exhausted. Around the garden, Elena watched as the four women, Margaret, Victoria, Catherine, and Beatrice, began to solidify, their forms growing stronger and more vibrant as the curse's hold on them shattered. But Elena felt the cost settling into her bones like winter. She would carry this child for 6 more weeks, love her with every breath, and then hand her to Ezra and watch them both disappear forever. She would live the rest of her life knowing her greatest act of love had been giving up the person she loved most. "The sacrifice isn't my life," she said aloud, understanding flooding through her with crystalline clarity. "It's my right to be her mother. That's what breaks the chain. Not death, but the willing surrender of the bond that makes the curse possible." Constance's ghost smiled for the first time in 150 years, and as she did, the earth beneath Elena's feet erupted with new growth, not the twisted vines of the cursed garden, but ordinary flowers, beautiful in their simple mortality. The curse was breaking, but Elena's real trials were just beginning. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no rain, no supernatural howling, just the soft whisper of ordinary flowers swaying in a natural breeze. Elena knelt in the transformed garden, her hands still pressed to the earth where Constance's remains lay, feeling the profound absence where malevolent power had thrummed for 150 years. Around her, the 4 women who had been trapped between life and death were becoming fully solid again. Margaret stretched her arms toward the sky, marveling at the sensation of cool air against skin that could finally feel again. Victoria laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the marshlands. Catherine and Beatrice embraced each other, tears streaming down faces that were no longer translucent. But Elena couldn't share their celebration. The weight of what she'd chosen pressed against her chest like a stone, making each breath an effort. 6 more weeks, 6 weeks to carry this child, to feel her move and grow, to whisper lullabies she'd never be allowed to sing again. 6 weeks to love someone she'd have to give away forever. "Elena." Ezra's voice was soft, careful, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She stood slowly, her hand instinctively protecting the curve of her belly. "The curse is broken, but its breaking depends on me keeping my word. If I try to reclaim her, if I even stay in contact, the whole thing unravels. Evangeline's power came from possessive love, from the refusal to let go. I have to be everything she wasn't." Margaret approached, her face radiant with freedom but her eyes full of understanding. "Child, what you've done, what you're choosing to do, it's the bravest thing any mother has ever attempted." "It doesn't feel brave," Elena admitted, her voice breaking. "It feels like I'm dying from the inside out." Victoria joined them, reaching for Elena's hands. "That's what makes it brave. You're choosing agony for yourself to spare countless others. Every future daughter who might have been born into this curse will live free because of what you've sacrificed." The house behind them was changing too. The twisted architecture was straightening, the poisonous ivy falling away to reveal original stonework, weathered but sound. Windows that had been dark for decades now glowed with warm, ordinary light. Bellwether House was becoming what it should have been, a home instead of a prison. "The others are going," Beatrice said softly, gesturing toward the marshlands. Elena turned to see Constance's ghost one last time, the young woman's form already beginning to fade. But this wasn't the desperate dissolution of the curse feeding on her essence. This was peaceful, natural, a spirit finally able to rest. Constance raised one translucent hand in farewell, her lips forming words Elena couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Thank you." Then she was gone, and with her departure, the last traces of Evangeline's malevolent presence vanished. The air itself felt different, cleaner, lighter, free of the oppressive weight that had saturated this place for 5 generations. Elena sank onto the garden bench that had materialized where twisted vines once grew, her body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. The supernatural strength that had carried her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind only human grief and the tender ache of early pregnancy. "I need to call my mother," she said suddenly, the thought surprising her. She should know about the house, about what happened here. Maybe there's a chance to heal that relationship too. Ezra sat beside her, careful not to presume too much closeness. "What will you tell her?" "The truth, or as much of it as she can handle." Elena laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "That I inherited a house, broke a family curse, and I'm going to give her granddaughter to strangers because it's the only way to keep her safe. Just another Tuesday in the Rossetti family drama." "She might surprise you," Margaret said gently. "Facing the supernatural has a way of putting ordinary family conflicts into perspective." Elena nodded, though she wasn't ready to hope for reconciliation just yet. Right now, all her emotional energy had to be focused on the impossible task ahead, learning to love completely while preparing to let go absolutely. The baby kicked, a gentle reminder of the life growing within her, and Elena pressed her palm to the spot. "I'll tell you everything," she whispered. "Every story about where you came from, every detail about this place and these women. You'll grow up knowing you're loved, even if you can't know by whom." The 4 women who had been freed formed a loose circle around the bench, their presence a comfort even in Elena's grief. They understood the price of motherhood in ways most people never would. "You won't be alone in this," Victoria promised. "We're free now, but we're not leaving. This is still our home, and you're still family. We'll help you through the next 6 weeks." Elena nodded, grateful beyond words. The immediate conflict was over, the curse broken, the supernatural threat ended, but the human cost was just beginning, and she would need all the strength she could gather for the hardest choice any mother had ever made. 6 weeks later, Elena stood at the entrance to Bellwether House with a suitcase in one hand and her phone in the other, hesitating before making the call that would bridge 2 worlds. The house behind her hummed with gentle activity, Margaret tending the flourishing garden, Victoria cataloguing the restored library, Catherine and Beatrice preparing lunch in a kitchen that finally felt warm and alive. She had changed in ways that went far deeper than the obvious swell of advanced pregnancy. The woman who had fled Charleston in shame and fury no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that true strength came not from fierce independence, but from the courage to be vulnerable when love demanded it. The phone rang twice before her mother's familiar voice answered. "Elena, is everything all right? You sound different." "I am different, Mom." Elena settled onto the porch swing that Ezra had installed the week before. "I'm calling because I need to tell you about your granddaughter." A sharp intake of breath. "Your granddaughter? Elena, are you saying—" "I'm saying I was wrong to shut you out. I was so angry about being judged that I forgot you were hurting too. You were about to become a grandmother, and I took that away from you." Elena's voice steadied as she spoke truths she'd been practicing for weeks. "I can't give you what you probably want, Sunday dinners and school plays and graduation ceremonies, but I can give you this conversation, and maybe that's a start." The silence stretched long enough that Elena wondered if the connection had failed. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears. "I've been driving to Charleston every week, hoping to run into you somewhere. I wanted to apologize, but I didn't know how to find you." "I haven't been in Charleston. I inherited Great-Aunt Constance's house." Elena looked out over the marshlands, where afternoon light painted the Spanish moss in shades of gold. It's been complicated, but I've learned some things about our family, about the women we come from. We're stronger than either of us realized. Constance left you her house, but Elena, that place has been abandoned for decades. It's practically falling down. Elena smiled, remembering the twisted wreck she'd first encountered. Not anymore. It just needed someone to care for it properly, to give it a chance to be what it was meant to be. They talked for an hour, tentative at first, then with growing warmth as old wounds began to heal. Elena found herself describing the restored house, the garden blooming with ordinary flowers, the sense of peace that had settled over the property. She spoke carefully around the supernatural elements, but conveyed the essential truth. This place had been transformed by love choosing healing over hurt. "I want to see you," her mother said finally. "Both of you. I know I don't have the right to ask, but you do have the right. You're my mother, and despite everything, I love you." Elena pressed her hand to her belly, where the baby had been remarkably calm all day, as if sensing the importance of this moment. "But I need you to understand that this won't be a normal grandmother relationship. There are circumstances I can't fully explain that will make things different." "Different how?" Elena closed her eyes, preparing to say the words that would make her sacrifice real. "She won't be staying with me after she's born. I've made arrangements, good people who will love her and give her everything she needs. It's not what I want, but it's what has to happen." The silence that followed was profound. Elena braced herself for arguments, demands for explanation, the kind of maternal outrage that had driven their original conflict. Instead, her mother's voice came back soft and wondering. "Oh, sweetheart, what kind of impossible choice are you facing?" The understanding in her tone broke something open in Elena's chest. This was what she'd needed months ago, not judgment, but recognition that her decisions came from love rather than defiance. The kind where being a good mother means not being a mother at all. "Then I'll support whatever you've decided. And if there's a way for me to know her, even from a distance, I'd like that. But only if it's what you want too." Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks, not the bitter tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, relief maybe, or gratitude. "I want that very much. I want her to know she comes from women who loved fiercely, even when love led them to impossible places." When she hung up the phone, Elena found Margaret waiting in the doorway with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "How did it go?" "Better than I hoped, different than I expected." Elena accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling its familiar comfort. "I think I'm finally ready for what comes next." The woman who would give birth in 2 weeks was not the same person who had arrived at this house broken and furious. She had learned to love without possessing, to heal without forgetting, to choose hope even when it demanded everything she held dear. Margaret settled beside Elena on the swing, her presence warm and steady as they watched the sun paint long shadows across the transformed garden. "Are you certain about the arrangements with the Hendersons?" Elena nodded, her hand resting on her belly where the baby had been unusually still all afternoon. "David called yesterday. They're ready, and they understand the conditions. No contact information, no updates, but they'll make sure she knows she was loved before they ever met her." Her voice caught slightly. "They're good people, Margaret. I can feel it. Ezra chose them well." It had been Ezra who found the Charleston couple through his network of social workers and child advocates. Sarah and Michael Henderson, who'd been trying for years to have children and had just completed the adoption process. When he'd explained Elena's unusual requirements, they'd accepted without question, understanding that some gifts came with necessary mysteries. The screen door opened, and Victoria emerged carrying Elena's latest project, a leather-bound journal filled with her careful handwriting. "You finished it," she said, settling into the nearby wicker chair. Elena accepted the book, running her fingers over the cover she'd tooled with images of Spanish moss and marsh birds. Every story I could remember. Family history, the women of this house, what we learned about love and sacrifice. Even the parts she might not believe until she's older. She opened to a random page and read silently, "Your great-great-grandmother Constance was barely 18 when she chose to save a man's life, rather than her reputation." That choice echoed through 5 generations, teaching us that love always costs something, but the cost is always worth paying. "She'll treasure it," Catherine said from the garden, where she was cutting herbs for dinner. "Someday, when she's old enough to understand impossible choices, she'll know exactly where she came from." The baby kicked suddenly, a sharp, urgent movement that made Elena gasp. Margaret immediately focused on her, that supernatural perception that remained even after the curse was broken, detecting what human senses couldn't. "It's time," she said quietly. "She's coming tonight." Elena felt a wave of emotions so complex they defied naming. Joy and terror, anticipation and grief, love so fierce it felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. Already? But it's still 2 weeks. "She knows," Beatrice said, emerging from the house with Elena's hospital bag. Children born into extraordinary circumstances often arrive on their own schedule. She's choosing her moment. As if summoned by some invisible signal, Ezra's truck appeared on the winding drive. He'd been staying in Charleston for the past week, ready to make the hour-long drive at a moment's notice. Elena watched him approach, this man who'd become something indefinable, not quite lover, not quite friend, but the person who understood her sacrifice better than anyone. "Hey," he said softly, taking in the scene with those perceptive dark eyes. "How we're feeling?" "Terrified," Elena admitted, "ready. Like my heart is about to explode in every possible way." Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she gripped the swing's chain. "I keep thinking I should feel different about giving her up, that maybe the reality will change my mind. And I love her too much to change my mind." Elena stood slowly, accepting Ezra's steadying hand. "I love her so much that I'm going to spend the rest of my life missing someone I only got to hold for a few minutes. But she'll be free, and that's worth everything." The drive to Charleston passed in a blur of Spanish moss and setting sun, Elena's head resting against Ezra's shoulder as contractions grew stronger. Margaret sat in the back seat, her presence a calming anchor as Elena's body prepared for the most significant moment of her life. "The Hendersons?" Elena asked as they reached the city limits. "Waiting," Ezra confirmed. "Sarah's been carrying around the baby blanket her grandmother made for weeks. Michael's already child-proofed their entire house twice. They're going to love her completely." At the hospital, everything moved with efficient compassion. Elena had chosen a facility known for handling unusual adoption circumstances, where the staff understood that not every birth story followed traditional patterns. Dr. Williams, who'd been caring for Elena throughout her pregnancy, greeted them with gentle professionalism. "Ready to meet your daughter?" she asked, and Elena nodded, tears already beginning. The labor was intense, but mercifully brief. As Elena held her baby girl for the first and last time, she felt the weight of 5 generations settling into perfect balance. This child had rosetti eyes, but something entirely new in her expression. A clarity that spoke of freedom from ancient burdens. "She's beautiful," Elena whispered, memorizing every detail. "Perfect. Free." She kissed the baby's forehead softly. "I love you enough to let you go. Remember that, always." When Ezra gently took the baby to carry her to her new family, Elena felt something inside her both break and heal simultaneously. The curse was truly ended. The cycle was finally broken. 6 months later, Elena stood in the fully restored conservatory at Bellwether House, working on a painting of the marsh at sunset. Her mother visited monthly now, their relationship rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and understanding. The 4 women who shared the house had become her chosen family, their bond forged in sacrifice and strengthened by love. Sometimes, walking through Charleston, Elena thought she glimpsed a dark-haired toddler with familiar eyes, but she never looked closer. That child belonged to the world now, free to write her own story without the weight of supernatural legacy. Elena's story had become something entirely different, not the tale of a woman cursed by her bloodline, but the story of someone who'd learned that the deepest love sometimes meant the most complete letting go. In choosing her daughter's freedom over her own happiness, she'd found a different kind of fulfillment, the peace that came from breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them. Bellwether House stood strong around her, no longer a prison for lost women, but a sanctuary where love had learned its truest expression. And in the garden where Constance was finally at rest, ordinary flowers bloomed in extraordinary abundance, tended by women who'd discovered that the most powerful magic was simply choosing healing over hurt, hope over fear, and love over everything else. The curse was broken. The new beginning had already begun.